Hi, my name is Lindsay Athamanah, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and I am here to present my research on employers' perspectives about individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities working in the community. Like I said, I'm in University of Missouri St. Louis, and my colleague is Keely White, and she works at the Evidence-Based Therapy Center in Galway, Ireland. And so we've been working on this literature review for quite some time. So let's talk about this and move forward. So in general, employment is a socially normative activity that often defines adulthood and is critical to individuals' well-being, personal autonomy, and quality of life for all people, and including people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we know from research that people with IDD have told us that they want to work for a variety of reasons and prefer to work in integrated employment settings in the community versus sheltered workshops or segregated settings. However, only about 20% of adults with IDD in the US are competitively employed. And this is compared to 60% of working age adults without disabilities. In addition, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities have limited access to support services and skills in the workplace to obtain employment and then maintain that employment. So research has shown that we know there are several barriers to employment that have been categorized as supply side and demand side. And so the supply side of the barriers to employment are employment-related hard or soft skills. So it's the skills that you actually have to complete the job and to do the job. Then we have the demand side of the barriers. And these are related more to the employer, such as organizational culture, beliefs on additional costs, and negative attitudes of staff and coworkers. And research has shown that employers that have unfavorable attitudes, they do have them toward hiring individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We know that they report concerns with perceived lack of skills and legal issues. We know they have limited knowledge about disabilities and different disabilities, and they worry about poor productivity. And then these demand side barriers may lead then to having more negative attitudes from the coworkers and employers that would be potentially hiring and working with individuals with IDD. Thus, it's imperative to really investigate these employers' perspectives and attitudes in hiring and working with individuals with IDD in integrated employment settings to look at what we can do to improve the post-school outcomes and employment outcomes of individuals with IDD. So to address these questions, my colleague, Dr. White, and I looked at and conducted a systematic review of the literature to identify studies that have explored employer perspectives about individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and working and hiring them to be part of the integrated employment workplace. So as you can see on this slide, I have my Prisma chart displaying the process that we took when we were doing the systematic review. So we did searches in 8 different databases. We looked at SynHall, Educational Full Text, ERIC, Psych Articles, PsycInfo, Scopus, Sociological Abstracts, and Social Sciences Citation Index. We wanted to have a really comprehensive view of all the potential literature that is out there. We did our search in January 2018, and then we updated it just recently in January 2020. We used terms to search for different studies related to participant characteristics, so employers, supervisor, managers, owners, companies. We looked at outcomes. We wanted their perspective, perceptions, beliefs, views. We looked specifically at disability in regards to autism and intellectual disability. We wanted to really focus on those particular disabilities. And we also looked at different settings. So employment, supported employment, integrated employment, experience, internship, and vocational. So out of these searches that we conducted, we identified a total of 1,895 articles. And then through a rigorous screening process, addressing inclusion criteria, we identified 84 articles that we wanted to further check to see, were they really looking at employer perspectives, and specifically for intellectuals or individuals with intellectual and developmental disability. Through that process, we then identified 84 or 23 articles from the 84. So we got rid of over 1,800 that were not part of our study, didn't meet inclusion criteria. And then with these 23 articles, we completed an ancestral and forward search. So we looked at who had cited these articles and then their reference lists to see if we could identify any other articles that potentially we could have missed in our initial search that would be included in our study. And we actually identified an additional 24 articles, which then went through the whole process again, going through the backwards and the forward searches as well. So finally, we identified 47 articles that met our inclusion criteria, and we located and downloaded the entire article, and were able to read the full text. And we coded each article, specifically looking at specific criteria that we wanted to identify: participant characteristics, study methodology, data collection methods, locations, and locations of where the study was done, and prospective outcomes to gather the data that we needed. So one of our research questions was, what demographic characteristics and methodological approaches have been used when examining employers' perspectives toward employing individuals with IDD in integrated employment settings? So we wanted to know what types of people, what types of employers were being included in these studies, and how the studies were being conducted, using surveys, quantitative methods, or more qualitative in-depth interview type methods. So I know this table is a little small, but I can definitely, if you email me, I can definitely get you a copy of it. And fingers crossed, we hope to publish this very soon. Overall, there were about just under 5,000 employers included in the 47 studies, with 688 employees with intellectual and developmental disabilities included in the studies, as well as an additional about 1,000 other participants, which were coworkers or family members, parents, that might have been part of the study as well. In terms of ethnicity, there were 663 white employers, 0 African American, or Black employers, 0 Latinx employers, 12 Asian and Pacific Islander employers, and 0 other employers. So about 86% of the studies did not report the ethnicity of the employer. And moving on from that, gender was also not reported for about 60% of the employers. Even with that, there were more male employers than female employers that were identified and included in the studies. The ages for the employers ranged between 16 to 77 years, and they were supervisors, managers, human resource personnel, and business owners. There were a variety of people they considered and identified as employers. And 30 studies out of the 47 did not report any ages of these employers. In terms of education level, employer education level, over 500 employers had graduated from high school. 123 had some college or went to technical school. Over 527 had their bachelor's degrees. 280 had a postgraduate degree, so we either had their master's or their doctorate. However, 71% of the employer's education level was not reported. and across all the studies. Employer experience with employer information, we just wanted to look to see if they had, was looking at two different categories: the length of being an employer, so in their current position or at their current place of work, and previous experience with an employee with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So employers across the board were in their positions between 1 to 25 years. However, 70% of the studies did not report any of how long the employers were there or how long they were in their current position. And then we have experience with hiring and working with individuals with IDD. At least 36 studies out of the 47 had some sort of experience, either hiring, working, or family member or friend or some other experience working and or befriending individuals with intellectual and developmental disability. In terms of the types of disabilities of employees, we were looking at them in 3 different categories. So we categorized them out with autism spectrum disorder, intellectual disability, and other. And other included if people with learning disabilities, traumatic brain injury, cerebral palsy were included in the study. We wanted to identify those as well. There's a big discrepancy in the types of disability that were included or the employers focused on in these studies. There were only 6 studies focused on employees with autism spectrum disorder. 41 studies focused on employees with intellectual disability, and 7 studies included additional employees with different disabilities. So the primary methodology that was used to explore employer perspectives was quantitative. So they used surveys, mainly informal surveys, so surveys that the researchers themselves had created and used to collect the data. 10 studies had used a qualitative methodology using interviews and focus groups to gather data and then conducting a thematic analysis of emerging themes in the data and what employers were thinking and their perspectives. And there were 3 mixed method studies, so 3 that used both quantitative methods and qualitative methods, and then merging these methods and the analysis together to build a more robust study. Overall, 27 studies were conducted in the US, 6 in Canada, 4 in Australia, 4 in Israel, 3 in the UK, 2 in Italy, and then Sweden, Taiwan, and Austria each had only 1 study conducted. So the majority of research that has been conducted on employer perspectives has been happening since the 1960s, and the majority have been conducted in the United States. So what has been, another research question that we had in this systematic review was, what has been the actual employer perspectives on working and hiring individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in community employment? So what we gather, what the studies were telling us, is that the more experience and previous experience that the employers had, it actually resulted in more positive perceptions. They felt employees with intellectual and developmental disabilities had a positive effect on the workplace, where those that did not necessarily have experience may not have had such positive perceptions of their work and ability. They also said that the higher the education levels of the employers, the younger the employer, so under age 39 and below, and the larger the company, these employers had slightly more positive perceptions of employees with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the workplace. We also found that their perspectives that employers welcome support, examples of job coaching and different accommodations and modifications that would help and support the individual with intellectual disabilities. They felt that these were critical for the employee's success, and they welcomed that support. They certainly did not shun it, and they wanted the employees to be as successful as they could. However, we still found that employers, even in studies up through 2017, continued to still have low expectations for their employees with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So what does this all mean? What does this mean when we've aggregated all this data and all these studies that have looked at employer perspectives? What does this mean for the field? So research on these employer perspectives has only been conducted in 9 countries. So the US, Australia, Canada, etc., with the majority conducted in the United States. Because not every country has the same workforce, experience, or type of businesses, studies need to be conducted in additional countries to further understand how employers perceive individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities working in integrated work settings across the globe. So employers may have differing perspectives about including those with IDD in the workplace, as well as different strategies that may or may not have worked to improve employment outcomes, depending on the respective business culture and people and coworkers. So increasing the research to encompass a more diverse and global employer population could potentially provide critical information to improve employer perspectives, hiring practices of individuals, and integrated employment models that could be generalized and used in other employment and cultural contexts. Overall, the majority of the employer perspectives were focused on individuals specifically with intellectual disabilities. So we definitely need to conduct more studies focused on exploring employers' perspectives of individuals with autism spectrum disorder, especially because there has been such a push and an increased employment opportunities in different large companies such as Microsoft, Ford, Ernst & Young, Walgreens, looking specifically for employees with autism spectrum disorder. So we do need to conduct more research looking at their perspectives on employing employees with ASD. A third point was that most perspectives in the studies that we identified were collected through informal surveys. So they were focused on specific constructs identified by the researcher. So we cannot necessarily compare perspectives across studies because they were not necessarily measuring the same variables. And the tools that they were using weren't necessarily reliable or valid. They didn't have reliability and validity to be able to look at the results across studies and to be able to then generalize any type of perspectives. So we really need to look at and start focusing on creating creating tools that can reliably and have validity when looking at employer perspectives, so we can start looking across different settings and different people and different cultures. And finally, although several studies found that employers reported having positive perspectives about individuals with IDD working in integrated employment settings, and it continuously got better as the years progressed, others reported that employers continue to harbor those negative attitudes and low expectations of individuals with IDD engaging in work. So positive attitudes were generally related, again, to the previous experiences that they had, either hiring or working with individuals with IDD in the workplace, either being a work-based setting for kids in high school or college to be able to come and work with them and get some extra help and information. Also the education level of the employer, so the higher the education that they had, the age of the employers, so the employers that were a bit younger, and the company size, so the larger the company, seemed also to have impact on the positive perspectives of employees with intellectual and developmental disabilities. In addition, like I said, it reported job coaching is a critical success for employees with IDD to be successful in the workplace. They didn't think of it as a hindrance. They didn't think that that was an issue with costs, they thought that it was especially important for the success for the employees. So despite progress towards positive perspectives of working with and hiring individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, individuals with IDD continue to be or underemployed in integrated employment settings. So this continued negative perception by the people who are hiring in the workplace and the low employment rate of those with IDD is disconcerting. So we need to further our research exploring employers' perspectives on hiring individuals with IDD in the workplace, because it's vital so that we can continue to understand how these perspectives may impact the employment outcomes of those with IDD, as well as potentially working on interventions and creating programs and trainings for employers and employees to be more aware and accepting and being able to work with the employees with intellectual and developmental disabilities to impact the employment outcomes more positively. So that's it. It's just a quick little APSE talk. Thank you for coming and listening to my quick little speech about our study. My name is down there and my email, athamanah@umsl.edu. You can ask me more questions and I can take questions now if they have any. So thank you.